In the early spring of 1941, when war clouds gathered overseas, a different kind of dread rose from the bayous of Louisiana. Locals in St. Landry Parish began reporting an impossible sight: a full-sized wooden steamboat drifting silently through the swamp at night, glowing faintly beneath the moon, and vanishing by dawn. The strangest part? No river ran deep enough to carry such a vessel. But when searchers entered the cypress maze to investigate, they found pieces of a real ship, rotting in mud that hadn't seen open water in 100 years. And that was only the beginning. In the early months of 1941, Louisiana's swamps were restless. The winter rains had lingered longer than usual, flooding the bayous and turning the cypress groves into a maze of black water and whispering reeds. Locals said the swamp breathed different that year, that the air carried something heavier than fog. St. Landry Parish, a quiet patch of land stitched together by marsh and memory, found itself at the center of something inexplicable. That was when the first sightings began. Quiet at first, whispered among fishermen and trappers, until the whole parish began to listen. It started with two cousins, Clem and Louis Beauregard, who made their living setting traps deep in the Atchafalaya Basin. They were simple men, used to long nights and strange noises. But what they saw one March evening would shake them to the core. As they paddled through the mist near Cypress Bend, their lantern light caught something impossible: a steamboat gliding between the trees. It was too large, too perfect to be real. Its paddle wheel turning without sound, its deck lined with pale, motionless figures. At its bow stood a man holding a lantern that flickered blue, casting light across the fog like an echo of lightning. The cousins froze. The swamp was shallow, far too shallow to carry a ship that size. And yet, it moved as though on open water, smooth and effortless, cutting through fog that seemed to follow it. Clem later said the ship didn't make a sound. Not the creak of wood, not the churn of water. Only silence so thick he could hear his own heart pounding. When they tried to move closer, the vessel simply faded. Not like it sank or drifted away. It just dissolved. The fog thickened, and where a ship had been moments earlier, there was nothing but open swamp. They rowed back before dawn, terrified but unsure what to say. In small Louisiana towns, stories traveled faster than truth. Within days, the tale of the ghost ship had reached every porch and store counter in the parish. Some laughed, others crossed themselves. The swamp had always been strange, home to old spirits, forgotten graves, and lights that danced in the fog. But this was something new, something that didn't fit the old folklore. Sheriff Walter Dupree, a practical man with little patience for superstition, dismissed the story when he heard it. He told the Beauregards that swamp gas and whiskey made for dangerous company. Yet beneath the ridicule there was unease. Dupree knew these men. They weren't drunks or dreamers. They were the kind who could read the swamp like a map. If they said they saw something, maybe they had. As spring deepened, more witnesses came forward. A fisherman claimed to have seen the same vessel gliding near the tree line, faint lights glowing along its rail. A farmer's wife said she heard music, the kind once played on riverboat, drifting through the fog at night. And one evening, two children insisted they'd seen a woman in a white dress standing on the water, singing softly as the floating house moved behind her. The parish began to stir with unease. Men who had hunted in those swamps all their lives suddenly refused to go near the old bayou after dark. Priests whispered of restless souls, and older folks said the swamp was remembering something. When a traveling preacher passed through and declared the sightings were a warning from God, the fear only deepened. But even those who didn't believe found it hard to explain how so many people could describe the same thing in a ghostly steamboat, drifting through fog that had no river to hold it. The swamp had always been full of secrets, but this was different. Something ancient was moving again beneath its still surface, and St. Landry Parish was beginning to understand that the past, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of resurfacing when the world grows quiet enough to listen. Long before 1941, the swamps of Louisiana had already been the resting ground for 1,000 untold stories. The Atchafalaya Basin, vast, winding, and half-drowned in shadow, had seen more than most places ever could. It was a land of ghosts before the ghost ship ever came. Beneath its still waters lay the remnants of sunken flatboats, forgotten plantations swallowed by mud, and the bones of soldiers who never made it home from the Civil War. The people who lived along its edges treated it not as wilderness, but as something alive, unpredictable, watchful, and far older than human memory. In the 19th century, the swamp had been both a refuge and a graveyard. During the Civil War, Confederate smugglers used its hidden channels to move supplies, gold, and prisoners away from Union forces. Some ships disappeared completely, swallowed by fog or ambushed by unseen gunfire. Locals whispered that the swamp itself took what it wanted. When the Union finally pushed deep into Louisiana, it left behind a trail of wrecks and wounded, both human and mechanical, that slowly sank into the black water and vanished. By 1865, the war had ended, but its ghosts lingered. Farmers rebuilding their land claimed to find fragments of old hulls buried in the mud, gunmetal turned green with age, and even skeletal remains wrapped in remnants of Confederate coats. It became common belief that the swamp was cursed, a place where lost souls from the war still wandered. Elders told stories of phantom drums echoing across the water at night, or of boats seen burning with no flame, their decks crowded with shadows. The most persistent legend came from the lower basin, a tale of a Confederate transport ship called the Marion Belle. According to oral accounts, it had been carrying weapons and gold upriver in 1863 when it fled from Union pursuit. Instead of surrendering, its captain tried to cut through uncharted waters, steering into a narrow bayou that wasn't marked on any map. The ship and its crew were never seen again. No wreckage was recovered, no logs survived. The story faded into folklore, one more name on the long list of things the swamp had devoured. Decades later, the region changed, but the swamp did not. By the 1940s, few remembered the details of the Civil War wrecks, only the unease that hung over certain parts of the bayou. Families warned their children not to wander too deep where the cypress trees grew too close together, or where the water didn't reflect the sky. Hunters said that when the wind went still, you could hear chains clinking underwater, or voices that weren't your own. Historians who studied the area often remarked that Louisiana's swamps were like a time capsule, preserving fragments of history untouched by the world beyond. Old river routes, hidden communities, and forgotten vessels all slept beneath the murky surface. The soil there was thick with both decay and preservation. Wooden beams from the 1800s could survive intact for generations, sealed away in the oxygen-poor mud. It was possible, even likely, that the remains of entire ships were still buried down there. But for the locals, this was not an archaeological wonder. It was a haunting. They believed that when a storm came or when the tides shifted just right, the swamp gave up its dead. Broken fences would rise from the water, old graves would surface, and sometimes, people said, even lost boats would appear, not as wrecks but as they once were, floating in perfect silence before vanishing again. When word spread in 1941 that a ship had been seen gliding through the cypress groves, older residents didn't laugh. To them, the swamp had simply remembered. The war may have ended 78 years earlier, but memory does not fade easily in a place that keeps its secrets so well. The Atchafalaya had always been a keeper of the dead, and now it seemed one of them had found its way back to the living. When Sheriff Walter Dupree finally agreed to lead a search party into the swamp, no one expected they would actually find anything. Most assumed it would be another wasted expedition, like the countless others the parish had mounted for strange lights, missing trappers, or phantom gunfire that echoed across the bayou at night. The sheriff gathered 5 men, 2 deputies, a local fisherman, and the Beauregard cousins who had first reported the sighting. They set out at dawn, their pirogues gliding through water as smooth as glass, fog curling low around the trees. The air was thick with the smell of rot and wet moss. Every paddle stroke felt like trespassing into a place that did not want them. For miles there was nothing but silence. No birds, no insects, only the distant drip of water from the cypress branches. The swamp seemed to be holding its breath. Then around midday, Clem pointed ahead. Through the mist, something enormous loomed between the trees. A dark, curved shape rising out of the water like the back of some sleeping beast. As they drew closer, the shape resolved into wood, warped, splintered, yet unmistakably crafted. It was a hull. The men beached their boats on a soft bank and stared in disbelief. Half buried in mud and tangled roots was the side of an old ship, its timbers black with age but astonishingly intact. It stretched nearly 60 feet across with what looked like the remnants of a paddle wheel still clinging to one end. The bow jutted upward as if frozen mid-ascent, and carved just beneath it, still faintly visible beneath the slime, were the letters SS Marion Belle. A chill moved through the group. Louis muttered a prayer under his breath. Dupree crouched down and ran his hand along the wood, cold and damp with a strange oily film that clung to his fingers. "This shouldn't be here," he said quietly. He was right. The nearest navigable river channel lay miles away, and no flood in living memory had been high enough to carry a vessel of that size this deep into the swamp. They explored the wreck cautiously, finding remnants that only deepened the confusion: iron fittings, old ropes turned to dust, and a few scattered pieces of glass and perhaps lantern fragments. One deputy pried open a section of collapsed decking, revealing a narrow stairwell that descended into black water. When he shone his flashlight inside, the beam caught something metallic beneath the surface, a shape that gleamed for an instant, then disappeared when the water rippled. The sheriff ordered everyone back, uneasy at how the air felt colder near the ship. He scribbled notes in his pad but said little. Later, when they returned to town, he filed his report but deliberately left out certain details, like the faint sound of creaking wood they heard when no wind was blowing, or the way the mud around the hull seemed freshly disturbed, as if the ship had recently shifted position. Within a week, word of the discovery spread. Reporters came from Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Historians arrived with cameras and notebooks, eager to document what they called a remarkable Civil War relic. They measured the hull, tested the wood, and concluded it was indeed from the 19th century, possibly as early as the 1860s. Some speculated it might truly be the Marion Belle, the Confederate transport long believed lost. Yet even as excitement grew, strange things began to happen around the site. Tools went missing. Campsites were found ransacked, though no animals were seen nearby. One night, a photographer woke to the sound of splashing water and saw ripples spreading from the ship's bow, as if something had climbed aboard. When he checked his camera the next morning, the plates were fogged, ruined beyond repair. Sheriff Dupree visited the site again days later, this time with a state historian. He noted that the wreck seemed to have shifted position slightly, the bow turning toward open water, though no current could have moved it. The historian, visibly unnerved, remarked that the wood looked less decayed than before, as though it had been preserved by something unnatural. Dupree didn't respond. But in his private notes found decades later, he wrote one sentence that no one could explain. "It feels like the swamp brought her back." That day marked a turning point. What began as curiosity became dread. The swamp had offered up a secret, but it was not done speaking. The sheriff's discovery of the half-buried steamboat should have put the matter to rest, but instead it ignited something in the people of St. Landry Parish, a quiet fear that grew louder each week. By early May, Sheriff Dupree was receiving daily visits from townsfolk claiming new sightings, strange sounds, and restless dreams. What began as folklore was now a matter of record. Even those who laughed at ghost stories began to feel the unease spreading like fog through the parish. The Beauregard cousins returned to the swamp often, driven by curiosity and guilt. Clem claimed he couldn't sleep. Every night he heard the faint sound of a paddle wheel turning in the distance, echoing through the reeds. Louis said he saw lights drifting through the trees, moving in a slow rhythm, lanterns swaying just like the ones they'd seen on the Phantom ship. They told Dupree these things quietly, hoping for reassurance, but the sheriff had none to give. He'd been hearing the same sounds himself. When he first organized a formal investigation, Dupree brought along 2 deputies and a reporter from the Opelousas Courier. The group camped near the wreck, documenting its structure and surroundings. At night, the swamp came alive with strange noises, a creaking sound that seemed to come from within the hull, and soft splashes, as if something large was moving in the water nearby. The men joked that it was just the swamp shifting, but their laughter was forced. Even the reporter, who had started the journey full of skepticism, wrote in his notebook that he felt the presence of a thing that does not belong to this century. On the 3rd night, one deputy woke screaming. He claimed he saw figures standing on the deck of the sunken ship, men in old uniforms, their faces pale, their eyes reflecting the lantern light like wet glass. When the others ran to look, the deck was empty, but Dupree noticed footprints, fresh impressions in the mud leading down from the wreck and vanishing into the water. The next morning, something even stranger happened. A thin mist rolled in, heavier than usual, blanketing the camp in white. Through it came the sound of a bell. Not a church bell, but the sharp, hollow clang of a ship's signal. It rang 3 times, then stopped. Dupree's men searched for the source, but the swamp was utterly still. No wind, no movement. Just the lingering echo of something that shouldn't have been there. When the group returned to town, the reporter's story ran under the headline, "Ghost Ship in the Bayou, Fact or Folklore?" The article drew attention across Louisiana, bringing more visitors and treasure hunters. Yet every new expedition ended the same way, with confusion, unease, and a mounting sense that something unseen was watching them. One historian from New Orleans claimed his compass spun wildly near the wreck, while another said the air grew freezing cold when he tried to collect wood samples. Locals began to say the swamp didn't like being disturbed. They believed the Marion Belle wasn't meant to be found, that she'd been resting in peace until something or someone woke her. An elderly woman from nearby Ville Platte claimed her grandfather had once served on a Confederate transport of that same name. She said he told stories of a curse, that the captain had killed prisoners aboard, dumping them into the swamp when they begged for mercy, and that their souls had bound themselves to the vessel in revenge. Dupree didn't believe in curses, but he couldn't deny what was happening. The men who visited the wreck often came back changed, quiet, nervous, unable to sleep. Some reported hearing whispers when alone near water. One man swore he saw a hand reach up from the swamp and brush against his boat before vanishing beneath the surface. By late May, the sheriff ordered all expeditions halted. He declared the site unsafe, blaming environmental hazards, but privately admitted to a deputy that he was afraid of what they might stir up next. Whatever the Marion Belle was, a relic of the past or something that refused to die, it had started to awaken the swamp itself. And the swamp, Dupree realized, was not a place that gave up its dead without consequence. When historians from Baton Rouge and New Orleans began examining the wreck, they quickly connected it to a lost Confederate transport ship from 1863, the Marion Belle. Records from the war described it as a sidewheel steamer used to move munitions and prisoners up the Atchafalaya River after the Union blockade tightened its grip. Its captain, Elias Crow, had been a proud and ruthless man known for his defiance and cruelty. The last message ever received from his crew was dated April 12, 1863, a single line in a Confederate logbook that read, "Entering unmarked waters to evade pursuit." After that, nothing for decades. The Marion Belle had been a ghost of history, a rumor kept alive by aging veterans and local storytellers who claimed the swamp had swallowed her whole. Some believed Captain Crow deliberately steered the vessel into the marsh, preferring to vanish than surrender. Others said the ship was lost in a storm that churned the river backward, dragging it into the flooded lowlands where no man could follow. But none of those stories explained why the ship appeared again, nearly 80 years later, in almost perfect form. When the discovery reached state archives, naval experts arrived to compare the wood, design, and construction. Their findings were unsettling. The type of timber used in the hull, longleaf pine, matched those sourced by Confederate shipyards during the war. Even more chilling was what they found embedded within the structure, a brass plate engraved with the letters EC and a date, March 1863, Captain Elias Crow's initials. The men who studied the wreck began to notice strange inconsistencies. Some parts of the ship looked ancient, softened and darkened by age. Others appeared far too new, as if they'd been restored recently. One engineer remarked that it was like 2 times meeting in one body, part relic, part living thing. When they attempted to remove samples for analysis, the wood seemed to resist cutting. The blades dulled quickly and one tool snapped clean in 2. Dupree watched the experts with growing unease. Every time someone tried to take something from the ship, the swamp reacted. A sudden gust would stir the trees, or a ripple would spread across the stagnant water though nothing had moved. One evening, a young researcher went missing after venturing out to photograph the hull at dusk. His camera was later found floating near the site, the last plate showing a blurred image, faint outlines of men standing on the deck, eyes white and hollow. The connection between the 1941 wreck and the vanished 1863 vessel soon became undeniable. Parish records described Confederate soldiers stationed near the area during the war, who reported hearing a steamer's whistle in the fog days after the Marion Belle was declared missing. When a small group investigated back then, they returned pale and silent, refusing to speak of what they saw. The swamp had already been feared, but after that, no one ventured near it again. Local elders began to whisper that the ship had been cursed long before it vanished. Some said Captain Crow carried gold stolen from dead soldiers, and that the swamp took it, and him, in retribution. Others insisted he had killed his own men after a mutiny, and that their spirits now guarded the ship, bound to it forever. Each version of the story ended the same way. The swamp buried the truth, waiting for someone foolish enough to uncover it. When Dupree learned about the Civil War connection, he became obsessed with understanding how a ship could reappear after nearly a century. But the more he studied, the less sense it made. The mud beneath the wreck showed no signs of long-term burial. It was soft, as if freshly disturbed. The trees around the site were too young to have grown around the ship, suggesting it hadn't been there for decades, but perhaps only months. Yet the structure itself was ancient, undeniable proof of its 19th century origin. Experts left one by one, unwilling to return after nightfall. The swamp seemed to play tricks on them. Footsteps behind them, whispers through the reeds, the constant sense of being watched. Dupree's final written note on the matter was brief and weary. If this is the Marion Belle, then she's not a wreck at all. She's something else, something that came back. The weeks following the confirmation of the ship's identity were marked by an escalating sense of dread. What had started as a historical marvel quickly turned into something darker. Locals began reporting strange lights above the swamp, glowing orbs that drifted low over the trees before vanishing without a sound. Fishermen claimed to hear music at night, old waltzes and hymns carried faintly on the wind, the kind played on riverboats during the Civil War. At first, people thought it was just imagination stirred by all the talk. But then came the disappearances. Louis Beauregard was the first. He'd been part of every expedition since the ship's discovery, often lingering near the wreck long after the others had left. One night he failed to return home. His small skiff was found 2 days later drifting near the mouth of the bayou, lanterns still burning, nets neatly folded, but Louis himself was gone. The search lasted a week before Sheriff Dupree called it off. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks. The swamp had simply taken him. In the days after Louis vanished, those living nearest the swamp reported hearing someone calling for help from deep inside the marsh. The voice sounded like Louis', they said, but it came from impossible places, far out where there was no dry ground to stand on. Some swore they saw figures moving between the cypress trunks, walking slowly through water that should have been too deep for a man. When the sheriff investigated, the air grew unnaturally still. No frogs, no birds. He wrote later that it felt as if the swamp itself was listening. By June, the atmosphere around St. Landry Parish had changed entirely. Families refused to let their children play near the water. Hunters abandoned their blinds. The church saw more people than it had in years, but no one stayed long after sunset. The swamp, once a source of life and trade, had turned into something else, a mouth waiting to swallow whatever drew near. One night, 2 loggers camping near the site woke to see the swamp aglow with a strange blue light. They watched in disbelief as mist rolled across the surface of the water and took on the outline of a steamboat. Not the rotting hull they'd seen before, but a fully intact vessel, shining faintly under the moon. On its deck stood shadowy figures, motionless as though waiting. A woman's voice drifted through the air, singing a melody that neither man recognized but both described as heartbreakingly sad. When they blinked, the light was gone. Sheriff Dupree tried to keep order, but even he was unraveling. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating, and spent long nights staring over maps of the swamp. Deputies found him one evening sitting in his car by the bayou, clutching an old revolver, muttering that, "It's trying to come all the way through." When asked what he meant, he said the ship wasn't just a ghost, it was a door, something caught between worlds. The swamp was the only thing keeping it from crossing completely. Meanwhile, the environment around the wreck seemed to shift unnaturally. Trees closest to the hull began to die, their bark peeling like burned skin. The water darkened, turning thick and sluggish. On windless nights, faint ripples spread outward from the wreck as if something moved beneath. Researchers who tried to return found their compasses useless, spinning endlessly. Cameras malfunctioned, and recorded voices captured low murmurs no one could explain. Locals started burning lanterns along the waterline, a tradition borrowed from older superstitions, a way to keep the spirits moving. Yet even the oldest residents admitted they'd never seen the swamp so restless. One man described it best in a letter written that summer. It feels alive, but not in the way a forest should be. It feels like it's remembering something terrible, and making sure we do too. By late June, the Marion Belle had become more than a wreck or a mystery. It was an infection in the land, a reminder of something unholy buried too long. And the swamp, whatever it truly was, had begun to stir with a consciousness all its own. By July, the swamp had gone quiet in a way that was almost unbearable. The usual hum of life, frogs, crickets, the low moan of wind through the reeds, had faded into silence. Even the water seemed to move slower, its surface coated with a strange oily sheen that reflected the moonlight in streaks of dull silver. Locals said the swamp had sealed its mouth as though it were hiding something within. The parish council finally ordered a full investigation. State officials arrived with equipment, survey maps, and men who thought the stories were nothing more than superstition. Among them was Dr. Henry Collier, a geologist from Baton Rouge known for his skepticism. He dismissed the tales of ghosts and vanishing fishermen as collective hysteria, and insisted the swamp's decay was the result of chemical seepage from abandoned plantations upstream. The locals said nothing. They'd seen what chemicals couldn't explain. Dr. Collier and his team set up camp near the remains of the Marion Belle. They installed floodlights and generators, determined to study the wreck scientifically. For the first night, everything seemed ordinary. They measured soil samples, took photographs, and mapped the hull's outline. But on the second night, one of the floodlights began to flicker. Then all of them went out at once. When they came back on, one of the men, technician Paul Nance, was gone. His boots and flashlight lay in the mud just a few feet from where he'd been standing. The remaining crew searched for him until sunrise. There were no footprints leading away, no splash, no drag marks. Collier wrote in his logbook that the air felt heavier after that, as though something invisible had pressed down on the camp. They continued their work, but every night after the swamp grew louder, not with life, but with echoes. The men heard distant clanging like metal chains being dragged through water. Sometimes they smelled burning wood, though there was no fire. One by one, they began to refuse night shifts. A week later, they unearthed something beneath the wreck, a rusted iron chest half buried in silt. Collier noted it was not part of the ship's cargo, and that its design resembled antebellum strongboxes used to store valuables or records. The men hoisted it onto dry land, but before they could pry it open, a tremor rippled through the swamp. Water surged unexpectedly, flooding the excavation site. In the chaos, the chest slipped from the pulley and vanished into the muck below. When the water receded, the ground where it had fallen was cracked open, releasing a foul, sulfurous odor that made several men vomit. That night, the crew left. 2 days later, their supply boat returned to find the camp abandoned. The tents were shredded, notebooks scattered, cameras smashed. The swamp had reclaimed the site entirely. Only Collier's logbook remained, half-soaked but legible. His final entry read, "It's not the ship that haunts this place. The ship is the bait. Something deeper is awake beneath it." After that, no one dared return. Even the most stubborn locals avoided the bayou, saying it had turned black to the bone. Cattle refused to graze near it, and birds flew wide around its perimeter. The marsh grass grew thin and pale, and a smell like old copper hung in the air long after rain. By August, St. Landry Parish was nearly deserted. The few who stayed told of hearing faint horns at night, riverboat whistles echoing from nowhere. Some said they saw lanterns bobbing along the water, moving in a slow, deliberate line as though a crew of the dead was still patrolling the lost route. Others swore that when the moon was low, the outline of the Marion Belle could be seen gliding silently across the bayou's surface, fully formed and gleaming, before dissolving back into mist. The authorities sealed the area, declaring it a restricted wetland zone due to instability and contamination. But those who lived long enough to remember said the real reason had nothing to do with safety. They said the swamp had become a threshold, a place where the past was still alive, where the dead refused to stay buried, and where something vast and ancient waited beneath the water, listening for anyone foolish enough to call its name. If you've made it this far, you've walked through the same swamp that still breathes in Louisiana's forgotten heart. You've seen what the records refused to print, the ship that rose from mud and memory and the silence that followed. But maybe the Marion Belle was never just a ship. Maybe it was a warning, or a promise. Before you leave this story behind, ask yourself, what if some places don't forget the dead but feed on them? What if every whisper in the water is a name waiting to be spoken again? If that question lingers, stay with us. Subscribe for the next descent into history's darkest corners, where truth rots slower than legend. And tell us in the comments, what do you think the swamp was hiding? Your thoughts, your theories, your curiosity. They're what keep these lost stories alive, because sometimes remembering is the only way to keep the past from rising again.